Shalom, everyone. Today we have Professor Tamar Dayan with us. Tamar Dayan is a full professor at the School of Zoology and chair of the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History at Tel Aviv University. Her research career is inspiring and is involved in various topics in conservation biology, landscape ecology, and paleoecology, including archaeozoology. Tamar's research group leads multidisciplinary research projects that explore patterns of biodiversity in natural and cultural landscapes, evolutionary ecology, nature conservation, and climate change and ecological communities. She also served in a number of scientific and environmental public positions. Last month, she was awarded for a Lifetime Achievement Award on behalf of the Israeli Association of Ecology and Environmental Sciences. Personally, during my academic development, I was very much motivated from her academic leadership. I remember, for example, a weekend that we spent together in Vancouver after an international zoological meeting where I first presented results from my PhD. We sat on a bench in Stanley Park, ate chocolate chip cookies, and talked about science. It is then that I knew that I want to be like Tamar. She was my academic model. An important part of my and all of her other students' academic success was very much influenced from her strong parental care. We continue this approach also among our students. The branches of our academic tree include the great-grandsons and great-granddaughters that are trained here at Haifa in Reuven's, Nimrod, and Lee Perigal research groups. We all have the same roots, and we all are branches of the same tree. Each of our scientific efforts lead to a new knowledge. This knowledge is like a new floor in a building of science. We all build multi-story buildings. Tamar had built a tower. That is, of course, the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History Museum, which we will hear more about its treasure and why it is a gate to the past and a view to the future. So, Tamar, toda shuv for being with us today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is this good enough? Okay. Good afternoon, and thanks very much, Gil, Guy, and everyone for the invitation. And in particular, I was invited to give a story, to tell a story, which is always nice and easy, and it's a story that I like. So I'll tell you the story of the establishment of the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History in its scientific context. And since Ehud Spanier is part of this story, he can correct me if I stray from the history. So the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History is a national research infrastructure, and from the list of logos at the bottom, and each one of these organizations gave quite a lot of money to have their logo there, you can see that there was really national effort into its establishment. And before I talk about it, I will say something about my early research agenda, which Guy mentioned. My training is both in archaeology and in biology, particularly zoology. And I'm very lucky in this way because I was privileged to study the two most interesting topics I think that academia can offer. And so my early research agenda from a graduate student and then a young faculty member was to study the evolution of animal-human relationships, that is zooarchaeology or different parts of it. And that led me to an interest in the evolution of body size, because what we do is we see the morphology of animals or morphology of skeletons. And one of the interesting things about morphology is size and shape. And since body size is a huge determinant of the biology of species, I developed an interest, and in these two capacities, both studying zooarchaeology and the evolution of body size, I spent quite a lot of time in natural history museums abroad, and I loved it. It's like treasure troves. You go there and you see things you can't believe someone has actually collected at some time, and you can go back and see the history of things. And I had a wild time. And I also studied the evolution of activity rhythms as an output of my interest in community ecology, but that was not strongly related to museum research. And as I was there having a great time and doing exactly what I wanted to do, and what I wanted to do was to study systems that had as little human impact upon as possible. So these are either early remains where human impact was relatively small, or desert mammals, desert communities, places where human impact to this day is lower. And this is what my generation of ecologists did, or did at the outset. We wanted to study really natural history, and we wanted to study real ecological populations and communities, and we wanted to steer away from human activity. And as I was having a good time doing that, the world was changing behind us. And you've all seen some version or another of this figure. This is my favorite version, because when I look at it, I see that my own parents, who are both still alive, and they still recognize me, when they were born, there were fewer than 2 billion people on Earth. What this means is that during their lifetime, they've already seen a quadrupling of the global population, human population. This has never happened in human history. Think of it. End of the Pleistocene, somewhere between 1 to maybe 10 million hunters-gatherers roaming the entire Earth. Now we have about 9 million Israelis roaming Israel. So just to give you an idea. And it took over 10,000 years to reach the first billion. And then it took 100 and something years to reach the second billion. And from then on, it rose exponentially. And when I was born, there were about 3 billion people on Earth. But I will not, this will not happen to me. It will not happen to any other generation, probably, of people on Earth to see a quadrupling of the global population during their time. Models predict that a leveling off at around 11 million people, still a lot of people, but a whole different ballpark. So this is a very unique occurrence in the 20th century. And clearly the people of the 20th century didn't realize as it was happening that their impact on Earth was changing, transforming the world in unprecedented ways that we still don't know exactly how to deal with. At the same time, the per capita GDP increased also more than fourfold. So all these this huge population was using resources also at an unprecedented rate, and producing chemicals and other substances that never existed on Earth. And one of them is the plastic bottle, of course. And you can't not ask, what were we thinking when we were producing something that we can never get rid of, or we don't know how to get rid of? And there are many other chemicals that are similar in this respect. So we've made a huge impact on the world without actually realizing until somewhere towards late in the 20th century that all this was happening. And when this was happening, one of the first things that was understood was the biodiversity crisis. And this figure comes from IPBES, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which shows the indirect drivers of change, and those are all human, demographic and sociocultural and economic and technological, etc. And then the direct drivers of change in terrestrial and freshwater and marine systems, which are basically the same, maybe in different, slightly different percentages. Land or sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. And on the right-hand side, you see the impact, the effects on ecosystems, species extinction risk, ecological communities, and one of my favorite, or least favorite really, is biomass and species abundance. Because we tend to look at binary, either has gone extinct or has not gone extinct. But actually, it's not a binary thing. What is happening is the populations, the ranges are contracting, and the populations are going down. And so their role in ecology is diminishing very, very rapidly. And we're not really studying it because it's so complicated to know that only recently some of the things were understood. For example, the decline of insects. We know now that in Europe, insects have declined by 60 to 80%. It must have a huge impact because insects are most of terrestrial biodiversity, but it's hard for us to assess exactly what's happening. Is this happening also in Israel? We don't know. Nobody's ever studied it. We're only now beginning to monitor. So the changes in global biodiversity have been enormous. And we care because we evolved in this ecosystem. We're entirely dependent upon its biological functions, and its biological functions are dependent upon its integrity to some extent. And we need this for our survival. And reports and studies show a reduction in ecosystem services, or most of ecosystem services on Earth. It's also, these reports show the same also for Israel. In addition, in recent years, the Stockholm Resilience Center developed a model looking at planetary boundaries. In green, in the center, you can see what is considered the safe operating space for humanity. And then as far as you go from this green, as distant, greater a distance, you're moving into unsafe grounds. And as you can see, loss of biosphere integrity is the furthest along. This means that this is the greatest risk facing humankind, according to these studies conducted by the Resilience Center and other independent scientists. We're unhappy also about climate change, but we're still not at the same rate. But biodiversity loss is a big threat to humankind, and it's made a huge difference to a big generation of ecologists. People like myself who started out looking at very basic questions in ecology, wondering about the general rules in ecology and in ecological communities, found themselves shifting, trying to address these grand questions and to see how we can manage biodiversity in a way that will minimize biodiversity loss and maximize ecosystem function. And it's true for an entire generation of global ecologists. I know very few ecologists now who don't actually do something in conservation. It's a big, big change in research agendas. By the way, novel entities that you see there are chemicals, plastics, and so on, which were only recently quantified by the Resilience Center, showing that this is also a major problem. From this figure from the Global Council of Science and the Environment, you can see the Living Planet Index starting in 1907 and ending in 2020, more or less. And you can see that in spite of international conventions and international decisions and Aichi targets and conferences and so on and so forth, there is a steady reduction in biodiversity. And this is considered a real risk or a real threat. Nowadays, loss of biodiversity and climate change are neck to neck in being considered the major threats to humankind. And of course, there's a call for unprecedented actions. And if you do actions, any action that you will take will be expensive, difficult to implement, hard to deal with normal economic structures, and you really want to know what you're doing. So that's why the shift in research agendas. So basically, the third millennium's greatest challenge is, and those are already our insects from our museum in the background, the greatest challenge facing humankind is to develop the tools to maintain a world population that grew fourfold in the past century or eightfold in the past 2 centuries in decent conditions while protecting its life support system, global biodiversity. And this takes knowledge about global biodiversity. I was thinking about zooarchaeology, and when were cattle domesticated? And now 1/3 of the world's land, because agriculture is the thing of the last 10,000 years or so, now 1/3 of the world's land and 75% of the freshwater resources in the world, this is again an IPBES report, are developed to crop or livestock production, which means a huge change in all our energetic outputs, our natural capital, land transformation, water resource transformation. When exactly did this happen? And is this an incremental process? And when does the revolution occur? And how did this affect past communities? These are all really interesting and exciting questions. And basically, these are questions that need to be asked because we need to know where we need to go back to so we can manage the ecosystem. On the right-hand side, you see a figure from the Ma'arag report, the State of Nature report published in 2018. And you can see that north to Beersheba, from the area that is not developed, that is not black or not aquatic, which is the blue, about half the area is already agricultural. And in the world where we have a problem now with food production and with food prices and so on, pressures are only going to increase. So if we look at Israel, the challenges are huge. It's a tiny country, heavily populated, very rapid population growth. As my parents were witnessing a 4-fold increase in world population, they also witnessed a 12-fold increase in Israeli population. Western level economy, constant war or hostilities over land, limited water resources, strong development ethos, strong agricultural ethos, immigrant society, and very few connections, little science and little conservation. And those are the cards that we were dealt and we need to deal with. So I had a dilemma, honestly. And one thing that I did was really shift my research to conservation research. And most of my lab does now conservation, straight conservation, looking at land transformation, ecological communities in this land transformation, planning and biodiversity, regulation and biodiversity, invasive species, et cetera, all the things that plague us and we need scientific answers to deal with. But again, with the dilemma of what we as scientists should do, many years ago, I think 12 or 13 years ago, I led the publication of one of my most important papers, I think, and that is biodiversity research and higher education in Israel. Looking at how is the state of Israel meeting this challenge? This is a scientific challenge. These are ecosystems are the most complex systems on Earth, and we need to know what we do with them. A big number of us got together, you're there also, to write this report, to analyze the situation. And unfortunately, we could see this figure. As the whole system, higher education system, was growing, Israeli biodiversity research was declining in 2010, and the trajectory, the expected trajectory, was grim. We're now returning to this report, trying to look again and to see, is there a change for the better? So far, so bad. The other thing, so I'm interested in science policy. I chair now a National Research and Development Committee on environmental R&D, and we're trying to impact how environmental and biodiversity R&D can occur. The other thing that I thought that we should deal with was taxonomy. When I started teaching many years ago, the assessment was that there are 3 million species on Earth. Now the figures, the lowest figure that I know is 8.7. The highest figure that I know is in the trillions. A new study published in actually a report of the National Science Foundation in the US that looked also at microbial life on insects and shows numbers in the trillions of living organisms. And on the other hand, only under 2 million species to date have been identified, have been described. And there's a big challenge in this description. In fact, there's a lot of publications looking at this problem. My favorite title, of course, is The Population, Ecology, and Social Behavior of Taxonomists, trying to analyze why this is happening. But it's actually pretty simple. And because biologists view this all the time as something that's really descriptive. And in many fields of study, descriptive is good. You describe trends and you analyze them, it's really cool. For some reason in biology, it's not considered cool. And someone always thought someone else will do this. And this is a major decline in the world. In Israel, we saw that this is simply different organs upon which you do bee taxonomy. As you can imagine, I can say that there's 1,200 species of wild bees in Israel, but I can't tell one from another. And probably it's the same for you. You need taxonomists to do that. The Global Taxonomy Initiative, as part of the Convention on Biological Diversity, was established to meet this challenge. And in Israel, we established, with the support of the ever wonderful Rothschild Foundation, the Israel Taxonomy Initiative, to train the next generation of taxonomists. Leon Blaustein of Tel Aviv, of University of Haifa, was involved in that, and people from all universities. And we managed to salvage Israeli taxonomy. I can't say that we did much more than to salvage, quite frankly. Israel is probably not going to be an empire of taxonomy, but hopefully we'll be able to continue to describe new species and identify existing ones. And an average year, between 50 and 100 new species are described by the experts in our museum. And considering the numbers that are of yet to be described, you can imagine that this is a full-time job. But my favorite is natural history museums. As I said, I worked a lot in natural history museums and I loved them. And what natural history museums do is they record nature, they study nature, and then they use their knowledge and natural history treasures for public education and enjoyment. Now, natural history is like all of the wonders of the living environment and of the abiotic environment. So to me, this is like should be the most prestigious thing to study in science. Again, in biology, for some bizarre reason, the approach to something like natural history was taken as descriptive, non-interesting, old, dusty, and let's wait for the scientists to retire and give their position to someone who does real science, molecular biology. So this has been a challenge. Now, natural history museums began with global exploration of the world. So really amazing names like Darwin and Wallace and Linné, who's actually the father of modern taxonomy. It was pretty amazing, just considering it was established in the 18th century, were among the first to contribute to natural history museums, and then also private collectors. If you saw the film Up and you remember the private collector there, that's pretty much what used to happen in a lot of places in the world. And natural history museums come in different sizes and shapes. There's national museums in the US, UK, France, and other countries. There's city museums in Rome, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other places. There's a lot of university museums, a lot, I don't know how many, frankly. What had happened was when Tel Aviv University was debating the issue very hotly, I asked someone to go over internet and look for natural history museums on internet, university-based. And after 100, the first 100, they tired out. So at the rate of discovery of new ones, we estimate somewhere between 200 and 250 university museums. And then there's a very small group of university museums that also serve as national museums. And those are primarily but not only in Scandinavia. And basically, this is what the state of Israel decided. The Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities already in the 80s said, let's not establish a national museum standalone research infrastructure, such as the Vulcani for biodiversity, but rather recognize the university collections as national collections, a national museum of natural history in the making. And this is what we were for many, many years. The key collections in our museum are what was fondly known as the Zoological Museum. And as you can see with Shimon Peres, our founding father, Professor Heinrich Mendelssohn, who is also the founding father of the museum. And then the herbarium, biological archaeology collections, and finally the physical anthropology collections all got together to establish the museum. This was really challenging because of the history of biology. Some of you, except for Ehud, are there other biologists? Guy, of course, possibly. Anyway, in biology, we had a big revolution in the 20th century, and that is the discovery of the double helix of DNA. And the feeling in biology was that everything that is modern and important and worthy of investigation will be understood from the subcellular mechanisms, not today, 10 years down the road, not 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, and if not 20 years down the road, then probably not important to know anyway. So if we have a figure of increasing complexity as we go up to the ecosystem and landscape level, which means a lot of challenges, there's also decreasing knowledge because there was, not only because of the complexity, but also because there was no focus on this research. It was considered obsolete, classical, not important. Wait for the person to retire, hire a real scientist. And this has happened all over the world. It's not unique to Israel. But it meant that establishing a natural history museum in the 21st century was particularly challenging because when we started work on this museum, our colleagues in the Faculty of Life Sciences were shocked. They felt that they wanted to be the Weizmann Institute when they grow up. And I was dragging them back into the dusty, obsolete basements of science. And I'll say that to them, they did their best to stop it. However, in the whole world, and also in Israel of late, there has been major change in our understanding of the value of natural history collections. As we said, they're the archives of nature. And if we want to know changes that have occurred in nature over time, and if we want to have a physical record of these changes, we need natural history collections in natural history museums. And one of the first articles to point this out was published in Biological Reviews, which is not very important. The important thing is that the co-author is Paul Ehrlich, who's one of the leading ecologists on Earth, and very, very, very famous. And so this paper gained recognition. And what they're showing is the drastic increase in use of natural history collections for environmental research. Used to be that most of the research conducted in natural history museums was systematic, evolutionary biogeography, history, prehistory. There is a huge increase in studies that are conservation related or environmental related. There's a huge increase in studies that evaluate the use of museum data to assess the status of biodiversity and to see the changes, and new statistical tools developed to do this, because natural history collections are sources of long-term data sets. And if you use wisely, you can see changes over time. And in some museums, you can see changes over billions of years. In some places, you can see changes over hundreds of thousands of years. Some places you can see the changes of the last century. It depends what scale you're interested in, but you have the record and you can see the changes that have occurred over time. So the unique characteristics of natural history collections are that they're the work of generations. They were collected by even our museum, which is relatively small. The collections were collected by dozens of scientists in varying timescales, in huge taxonomic breadth, and with huge taxonomic reliability, because the taxonomists work in the museum, and also because you can go back and check that the identification was correct, which you cannot in observational data sets. Observational data sets are humongous, but they're impossible to test. These are testable, and we have the voucher specimen. We can always go back and test the specific specimen. So natural history collections actually allow us to ask new questions as disciplines develop and evolve and new tools are invented. This cheetah was collected in the Arava Valley by Patel Schmitz about over 110 years ago. Now we used it to see if the genetic relatedness, whether they're more related to the Asian cheetah or to the African cheetah. Not surprisingly, they're more related to the Asian cheetah. And of course, when Schmitz collected this cheetah or shot this cheetah, nobody knew that there was any such thing as DNA. So you can go back to the same specimens and ask new questions with new tools and the human imagination. You can map species distributions, except for maybe giraffes and rhinos and elephants. All other species distribution maps are based on museum or herbarium specimens. We can gain insight into broad-scale patterns in biodiversity and study changes in species distributions and monitor environmental pollutants, etc. Just to give you an idea, for example, mammals, all the checklists are based on museum specimens because those are testable. Species distribution models used to predict shifts in response to climate change or used to analyze shifts that have already occurred in the 20th century, and big shifts have already occurred, are based on museum specimens. We can extract environmental pollutants, heavy metals and others from specimens, and these are examples that took place in our museum, and see over time the changes that have occurred. What happens when they open reading, for example? What happens when they close down the coal power plants? We can look at microevolutionary change and see how rapidly species can respond to environmental pressures, in this case, to climate change. We can track the appearance and spread of alien invasive species, and this, of course, comes from Vela Galil, Professor Vela Galil, this map, and monitor macroinvertebrates and aquatic habitats over time, and study changes in population genetics, because we can actually extract now the genes, and not only the genes of the animals, but also the genes of parasites and viruses. There was a big effort now in the world to look at all bat collections in the world in search of coronaviruses. Now that we all know to say coronaviruses, and we know bats are implicated, we can go back to the bat collections and see what we see and what happens over time, because the trajectories over time are really important. So we can monitor spread of parasites, pathogens, and ancient disease, and study natural substances for pharmaceutical and other industries. What this means is that natural history museums that have really collected very eclectically over the years based on researchers, research projects and graduate student projects and so on, need to rethink and look at their collections policies and practices to address new urgent missions. We are trying to do that with some success. It's a major challenge, not only to us, but also for other natural history museums. Because the knowledge of biodiversity of Israel is really in the museum or among the museum scientists and in the museum, and because the state of Israel really invested very heavily in the establishment of the museum, we were asked some years ago to embed in the museum Israel's monitoring and survey schemes. In terms of marine monitoring, we give support. We give support to the Israel Nature and Parks Authority to monitor their marine reserves. We give support to the Israel Oceanographic and Limnological Research Institute because of the taxonomic expertise, but we're not an oceanographic institute. We don't conduct the marine surveys or monitoring. On the other hand, we do conduct the terrestrial monitoring and surveys. And Hama'arag is when we have 3 applied policy relevant research centers working in the museum based on both the taxonomic knowledge and the expertise of the museum. One of them is Hama'arag, which does the terrestrial national monitoring, and it monitors processes, threats over time to try and see how things, not only at the broad scale, but also at the incremental scale, what changes occur and why, and in response to what threats, and also monitoring extreme events such as the Evrona Nature Reserve oil spill, which is something that's never happened in the world, and the Wadi Ashalim acid spill. After both of those, there's long-term monitoring. In 9 ecological areas, more than 900 monitoring units and permanent plots, looking by monitoring by key threats to each area and in a 2-year monitoring cycle. And that's one thing that occurs in the museum. And as part of this, we're also beginning to do insect monitoring. So we'll get an indication of what's actually happening in the bulk of Israeli biodiversity, on which we know very little at the moment. And then the Hama'arag publishes the State of Nature reports. Next one to be published is coming July 11, and gives us information about the changes that have occurred in the living environment. The other monitoring center that we operate is the Israel Center for Aquatic Ecology, which was established also in recent years to promote the use of biological monitoring as a tool for ecological state assessment of streams in Israel, to support decision-making in river restoration, rehabilitation, and in deciding how much water to put in rivers. And how much water should go in rivers now is an economic decision in Israel. And it needs to be science-based, or we will spend money for no reason at all, or not enough in efforts to restore. And to do this, we need macroinvertebrates. All the biological monitoring programs in the world are based on macroinvertebrates, and macroinvertebrates are what you see here. And to identify them, you need taxonomists. And so, especially since some of them are collected as larvae. So this program also does the biological monitoring of Israel's rivers and gives the information to decision makers how to manage Israel's rivers and how to work according to the European Water Framework Directive, looking at the ecological value of different rivers, in this case in north of Israel. And you want to look at the blue ones, but they're not very common. The red ones, unfortunately, are more common. And this is a basis for decision making. Finally, and I see that I have a problem with this slide, We are establishing, in the process of establishing the Israel Citizen Science Center. There is a growing tendency in the world now to look at, to use the public or to engage the public in scientific exploration. If the public knows what to look for, you will have thousands and thousands of extra eyes in the field that can look for biodiversity and report. And now, frankly, every child with a smartphone can report. On the other hand, this allows us to empower the public. The public can understand decision-making in terms of conservation, in terms of development, in a lot of things that relate to their environment. And in the last 10 years, citizen science is something that has grown exponentially in the world. And in Israel, there are several initiatives, some of them quite successful, such as the butterfly monitoring scheme of Israel, which we're part of, or the backyard bird monitoring and others. But it's difficult and it's expensive to maintain the digital platform, the reporting applications, the taxonomic backbone, the ecological analysis, and so on. And a group of organizations in Israel, including the University of Haifa, came to us and said, why don't you develop this at the museum? This is something that in all of the world natural history museums lead. And the reason that they lead this is that this is something that has something to do with the public and also something to do with science. And museums do both. And so Ofer Arazi and Dan Malkinson have been leading this in the University of Haifa and leading iNaturalist Israel, which is a digital platform that's now moving to the museum as part of this center, and of course in partnership, in active partnership with Ofer and Dan and others, because I don't know if you're aware of that, but the University of Haifa and the Technion together have a project called Taking Citizen Science to School. It's engaging school children in doing citizen science. So the Technion and Haifa and other organizations are also part of it. And what we're trying to do now is, as you can see, the critical importance of citizen science data, a rubric to evaluate citizen science programs, ecological monitoring, etc. And in fact, in Horizon Europe, in the New Horizon programs, there is a lot of room for, or in biodiversity, a lot of room for citizen science. And this is what we're trying to do. I'm sorry about something wrong with this slide, but as you can see, bridging the growing disconnect between a largely urban population and nature, empowering the public, and every child with a smartphone can become a scientist. And the idea, it's hard for me even to read this, but the platform is both technological, scientific, and social. It's a national project. It's in partnership with a lot of organizations. We're now just building the structure. We've hired some programmers and eco-informaticians, and we're trying for this to work, and we're trying for this to work for everyone, because there are initiatives, Jelly Watch, and other places in different organizations, both NGOs and universities. And what we are trying to do is to provide the center a hub and sort of source of knowledge and support for existing projects and to help budding initiatives, because that's what natural history museums in the world have been doing. Almost finally, some statistics. We have about 5.7 million specimens. This is arbitrarily chosen. We did some simulations, but we have about 3.5 million insects, which we can't possibly count. So this is somewhere in the ballpark. We have 26 curators who are faculty members and 11 active curator emeriti and 7 associate curators. And over 500 scientists use the collections every year. We're thrilled that the state controller, Mevaker HaMedina, evaluated us as a national research infrastructure 2 years ago, and we came out with flying colors, so we were very proud. And over 100 graduate students and a big staff that does, on the one hand, collections-based research, mostly taxonomic, and on the other hand, ecological research as for applied policy relevant research. And of course, lots and lots of visitors pre-COVID, and we're beginning to bounce back. This is some of the people. I won't go over the slides with the people, but I will say generally. This is a crucial infrastructure, but it's also a national infrastructure. We get national funds to maintain it. We also get university funds, but we get national funds. And we work really hard that all its programs will have national participation and that our colleagues from all other organizations enjoy it. Some of you have used our collections, others we hope will use our collections, and you're all welcome to come and enjoy the museum, but also conduct research in the museum. We're open to all, and we help our colleagues come to us, and we think this is our role, this is our mission. You know these people, some of them at least, and David Eilam and his son, and we hope to see you all with us at the museum. So thank you again for the invitation. You have to initiate it. We're trying desperately to do the Ma'arag report for the early 21st century at the moment. We have, it's a challenge because there's no blueprint to the museum in Israel. So getting the whole thing together and funded and operational and so on is a huge challenge. Of course, we've had the inauguration of the book on the Pleistocene mammals of Israel, and Guy and Yoram Yom Tov's. And if you want to talk about a report on changes, there's definitely something to talk about.
Going back to, you have a slide showing almost a linear increase in the publications based on the collections. I was wondering though, how much of that represents a real increase in interest in the collections themselves, or just a general increase in publication? I was wondering if you could address that.
Yeah, well, we analyzed this in the orange report that I showed. We looked at the increase in general publications in the world, and we compared that to the increase in biodiversity journals and of course, publications, and definitely that's a much sharper increase. There's no question about it. There's another measure, of course, of the proliferation of journals. 25 years ago, when Yael Mandelik needed to publish her first conservation paper, we had to choose from between 2 journals or something like that. And now there's around 50 biodiversity conservation journals. So the change is really enormous. It's a little slow coming to Israel, unfortunately. It really is slow for a lot of reasons that have to do with science policy and science politics more than anything else. And we're trying to make the change, but the change is really there. And you can see that even by the impact factors of the journals, many of our colleagues think that the impact factor actually shows the value of the journal, but really the impact factor shows how many people are in the field with the potential to cite. And the impact factor of conservation journals are now sky high. Whereas, conservation biology had a low impact factor 20 years ago, and ecology and American naturalists were the big winners. Now, the good conservation journals are way above the basic ecology journals and very high impact factors. It shows the number of practitioners or researchers and so on.
Thank you so much for this brilliant lecture. I want to ask something which is provocative on purpose, because this is this is seminar of the School of Archaeology. You show us that human population is growing exponentially, diversity is dropping, why being an archaeologist rather than being an ecologist or biologist that does conservation? Because where's the benefit, where's the impact?
Well, first, we were mostly motivated by our personal interests, of course. To me, I think this is an exciting time also to look at the changes that have occurred over time. I really do. I think we missed some point in time where there was a real huge change in our relationship with the environment. There are things that you need to learn, for example, to see what was the natural vegetation in prehistoric times in Israel or early historic times. You want to know what was the natural fauna and flora. You want to understand patterns that relate to human use of the environment. There's really exciting research going on in this respect. I think even the studies showing overexploitation in prehistoric times, both in marine resources and terrestrial resources and so on. So I think there's more and more studies that relate the paleoecology to the ecological questions, both in Israel and abroad, that are really, really important and interesting. So by all means, it's
not to leave our day jobs.
What?
Not to leave our day jobs.
No, not to leave your day jobs. Definitely not. Okay.
Tamara, I spoke about the scientific mission, obviously, this is what we came to hear, but I wonder still, because there is a focus out there and Royal Museum, how do you define popular mission, the outreach, the audiences, and how do you define at this point your success as a museum looking out?
It's an excellent question. Our mission is also public. I have to admit, I'm a scientist. 7 years ago, I sat with the Tel Aviv University administration, especially the Kishrei Chutz, the development office, and I said, guys, this has to be open to the public, but I do not want to be a slave to it. So we'll go into it in a big way. Only if you commit to raising X millions of dollars, that would not be my responsibility, but yours. And they said, oh, yes, of course, no question about it. And that's the last time I saw them. So I'm sure you have met similar experiences on occasion. We were very lucky that Michael Steinhardt remained true and committed, so we didn't crash. And we were actually incredibly encouraged and happy with the success in the museum, in that the Google reviews are 4.7, and before COVID, there were 200,000 visitors a year, of which 50 to 60,000 were school children. There were a lot of other children in families because it's a very family-oriented museum. And we felt that this was really important. We thought that this was contributing to education. We thought that this was contributing to empowering the public, raising an interest in science. We were really excited. And then COVID struck and everything plummeted. We were closed part of the time. We had Tav Segol, Tav Yarok, etc. And now we're beginning to bounce back. We have a dilemma all the time. We have now a global warning exhibition on climate change, which we thought was really, really good. It was getting really good reviews. And yesterday we got an email from an irate mother saying, you are messing with my children's brains. How can you, the children can take pencils with their commitment, like eat less meat or don't drive to work, but take your bike to work, and things that a person can actually affect. And this is brainwashing my children, and I will sue you, honestly, really, in those words. So we probably felt that we were successful, but I can't say that we've actually did anything to review our success so far, because basically, and would want to do some sort of pre-visit, post-visit research and work with schools and see what works and what doesn't work. And it's a dilemma because we don't want to to hammer things into the public. We want people to come there and really enjoy the exhibition and learn and relate through it. To us, that people will enjoy it is more important than that people will learn specific things out of it. And it was a dilemma, especially in terms of the environmental parts of the museum, because I was the chair of the Chavra Laganat HaTeva, so I would like to hammer everything into everyone's brains in Israel, but we refrained from doing this in the exhibition. We're fully booked with school kids until the end of the year, so that's a good sign. 7 days a week, by the way, except for Shabbat, which is open to the public. We also, Sundays, we now open to school groups, which is wonderful. And I hope someone comes to do a research on this. Our School of Education is not geared towards these things, unfortunately. And we now hope that with the partnership of taking citizen science to school, we'll get a little more extra studies, because we're sure that things can be done better. We just don't know how to, so we probably can. Okay, תודה רבה שוב. And I also just in connection with people.
הסתכלתי על התמונה, שהייתי כאילו, אז הפכנו. טוב, אני ממש
תודה רבה, תודה שבאת. תודה. יש אפשרות בנוסף. יכולה למשוך את זה החוצה?
כן, אפשר בקלות. שאלה אם אני יכול לסגור עכשיו את זה, או שאני מנסות לשאול.
זה יישאר לנצח.
פשוט תסגור אותו. כן, פשוט תסגור. אנחנו